Bonjour, bonjour à tous. Hi, this is Margaret Pinard. Welcome to my channel. We're live. We're giving off May of the Moderns vibes. Can you tell? Is it more Mary Poppins or is it more Seas Candies? Who knows? Little cameo action here. So welcome. We're down to our last May of the Moderns readathon Sunday discussion, which is going to be about the other or translated works in our designated period of 1901 to 1945. And this is the one I came up with, so no guest today, just me. So we'll see how that goes. If you've got any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got a few friends in the comments already. Shannon was here to say hello, hello. Anita was here to say hello, hello. And good morning to both of you on this holiday for Americans weekend. Yes, Cool Gamer says hello. Anita says it's a very Edwardian look. Yeah, the jacket isn't quite what I would wish, but it's close enough to be a little weird, and so it makes you stop and think, why? Why is she dressed like that? And that's the goal, right? All right, so we're talking about some things today, and there's a lot of possible things. So let me get this out of the way at the beginning. I thought I'd do a giveaway for people in the chat, and I haven't set that up yet, but I will. So anyone who comments, I'll spin the wheel and find something to give away. So that's a bookish package sent direct from me, a gift certificate in case you're not anywhere that's easy to ship to, and a Persephone book. So we'll see how that goes. So what do I mean by the other? Let me just set that up. So StreamYard, giveaway. Open that. What do I mean by the other? So anyone have any guesses? Anyone have any familiarity? Jim's book says, bonjour, mes amis. And Maggie says, hello, lovelies. Hope you're feeling better, Maggie, after fall a day or two ago. Yeah, hope that didn't upset anything. Guesses, contributions, opinions, the other. What do we mean by the other? So my quick definition to reel people in so we're on the same page is that othering or maintaining a sense of other is not, I don't use it in the philosophical sense. We'll get to that in a second. I consider it as more of a political tactic for our modern age that is used along gender, race, ethnicity, and religion lines for amassing and retaining power, which we're not going to get into the politics of that here because we're specifically considering the other and that practice in literature. But also I need to state that the obvious that for English speakers, the other is non-English literature. So that's why we're talking about books that are translated into English, although I'll give a few reverse examples as well. And this obviously dovetails pretty nicely with the conversation from last week that we had with Roz about empire. She posed a question that confronts writers in colonial and post-colonial areas, which is, do you write in the colonizer's language or do you write in your own language? Because there are drawbacks and benefits to each one. So it's sort of a philosophical choice at that point. But key thinkers and otherness, just to ground us in the underpinnings of this, we start with Hegel, and he's the one who I think uses the term first. And he's talking about the other in relation to the self, and he's talking about phenomenology, and that is not my domain. If you want more about that, go over and see Pei's channel at attention, ! And he will give you a ripe, old welcome with philosophy, which I cannot do. Then I would say the next interesting person who talked about the other is Simone de Beauvoir, and she came in sort of mid-century, 20th century to talk about how well, I have a quote for you. Simone de Beauvoir The influential feminist philosopher and author of The Second Sex described the phenomenon of men constructing the concept of woman from their own experience rather than from what women are in reality, stating that women are framed as the other while men are the self and subject. And I got that quote from a American University, what's it called? Not theorem. Thesis! Thesis, because I thought it framed it pretty nicely. In terms of, yeah, that's why we have a lot of problems in the medical system, is that when you measure all your medical tests against the self, the average, the norm, the ideal, dare I say, then you miss out that, people are diverse and have different medical needs. So, include diverse groups of people in your medical studies so that we have a diverse medical system. Duh. But yeah, so that's just one little arm. And then the last person I thought was interesting to hook in terms of a key thinker for otherness is Edward Said. He is a cultural critic, and I've got a quote from him from Wikipedia. It's a different source, but I just went to the Wikipedia page to grab this one. He said, to build a conceptual framework around a notion of us versus them is, in effect, to pretend that the principal consideration is epistemological and natural. Our civilization is known and accepted. Theirs is different and strange, whereas, in fact, the framework separating us from them is belligerent, constructed, and situational. And that is from his book, The Colonial Present, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Iraq from 2004. So I thought that was a great starting point as well. I have a book by him that I have not read yet called Orientalism that I've had for about 10 years. And yeah, that's like the most up-to-date one, but I've also heard criticisms of him. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth and a lot of like define the scope of what you want to say to make sure you're saying what you mean today. So, hang on to your hats. Let me drop that banner and say hello to the more people. Am I feeling stoned? Are you on medication after the fall? That's, yeah. So Jim is mentioning the other, like l'étranger, the outsider. Yep. Shannon's mentioning minorities, which is an overlapping word, I think. Yep. Jim's saying divide and conquer, which is, yep, how it relates back to empire and othering. That's the verb part. Maggie's supporting that with others, those who invaded. Yep. Roz saying hello, hello. R.C. Scott saying happy Sunday, hello. And Roz saying outside the mainstream of the culture or society you are in. And I think this is interesting because you can look at it as a personal othering, right? The culture or society that you are in, or it could be if you're looking at literature. And if you look at my shelf, and we'll get into this in a second, the publishing industry is overwhelmingly English, right? And so the books that people get are overwhelmingly English just by statistics, right? So there's a somewhat more objective view of this, but yeah, we can talk about the differences there. Jim says, Gertrude Stein once lamented that as a lesbian Jewish woman, she would be unable to compose the great American novel, being other in many aspects. Yeah. That's something that I would ask Amrita about. She's the one who was supposed to read Gertrude Stein last year. I haven't read her. And Anita says, it sounds like the single story viewpoint. Single story viewpoint. I don't know what you mean by that. So tell us more. So I've outlined some key thinkers that I thought would help ground us in the other discussion and get us on the same page. But now that we've got like a bit of a lens or screen about, we're talking about in literature, how people are treated when they're seen as other. And that's very obvious in many of the classics in the first half of the 20th century, including ones that we've discussed already or had buddy reads on. So, shout those out if you know them. And I just finished Not Without Laughter this morning. So I'm excited to talk to Shannon and Beth Ann about that on Tuesday. It's our last buddy read of the month. But as an English language primarily English language consumer, what do we choose to read that is translated? Because that is the most direct other we can get to in terms of language and literature, right? So if we don't have a language outside of our experience and we take a translation, how do we judge the value of that translation? I think this is super interesting right now because one of the things I've heard about marginalized populations writing books is that they don't get, if they get the chance to publish, because there's a moment where they're being allowed more spotlighting, right? If they get the chance to publish and they're hyped up because in the moment there's a trend, say, and they're having like the narrow part of the wedge to get into the publishing industry and make a splash. And then the reception is not what they expected or what might be objectively, even though there's no such thing, due to the value of their work. People leave reviews on books, for example, like Black women's narratives in fiction or science fiction and fantasy, just to take one that I've read some of, and say, it didn't feel relatable, or I didn't get it, or like, it didn't seem to apply, whatever, these kinds of things. We're judging a book based on a context that we don't belong in, right? So how do you judge in the same sort of way translated literature? And I looked up some resources on this, and we can get to that. Feel free at any point to jot down your thoughts. Anita's following up her comment. Thank you. Only seeing a different culture through your viewpoint. There's a great TED Talk on the subject. Ooh, okay. That sounds great. Thank you for dropping the link there. Only seeing a culture through your own viewpoint. Right. So basically like othering, single story viewpoint. Okay. So it's a different lens for the same type of feeling. Making yourself the self in the world and judging the story based on your view of it only. Okay. Shan says, my most recent reads that are translations are works from the Irish mythological cycle and historical cycle. Nice. Interesting. I wonder if those are translated from the early 20th century because of all of the folklore collecting that was going on then, or whether it was translated later, which might have an effect on word choice. Interesting. Jim's bringing up prizes. Yep. So I think he did a quick Google or a wiki search and found Nobel laureates for literature by nationality. So the top 10. So we've got 15 from France, 11 from the UK, 11 from the US, and the rest of the top 10 are European. I'm not sure how many you're counting then. Oh, I could have sworn that sneeze was coming. All right, it'll come later. Yeah, and I've actually got a Nobel laureate to talk about, which is from the Japanese. So interesting that you mentioned that. When I looked up prizes in terms of translated literature, I found a really interesting article. Let's see if I queued it up here. All right, let me put up another page. So I found two places. One was talking about, from the translator's point of view, you have a trade-off between exactness and specificity of words and flow in the target language. And I thought you're always trying to balance those two. So look for more for the flow and the feeling rather than like getting exact words or phrases or idioms correct. And someone mentioned that yesterday or the day before in our sprints when I was asking about translations. But then there's also, oh, I didn't go. There's also, how do you judge translations? The fact that when you have awards for translated works, sometimes the people who are doing the awarding are directed to consider the original text and the strength of the translation, or just to consider the English, the target language version, which is something completely different, right? So are you awarding the translator for producing a work of art based on someone else's, or are you awarding the translator and the original author for both of their work together? And is that influenced by what you perceive as the value of the languages, right? It gets very mixed up in there. So yeah. So pulling back from the prize winning for a second, because I don't have that ready yet. Draw says, I hate the idea of only reading things that are relatable. What's the point? Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of the short reviews are the lowest common denominator, and it's not my expectation. Therefore, I'm going to rate it low. And you're like, okay, get out in the world, see a few things, come back, get back to me. Shannon's saying some translated early, like 12th to 14th centuries. Oh my goodness. Some 19th century and others 20th century. Very little translated in our century. Interesting. So yeah, I don't know if you ever have people try to tell you things translated from the Bible and they get the Greek wrong, or they get the Aramaic wrong. And so the newer translations with more context and more study are actually like radically different things, but we've been living with this earlier interpretation for 1,000 years. And so it's like, hey, church, you want to revise your... Yeah, that's interesting. Roz says, so true, Jim, and it claims to be universal, unlike, say, the Booker, the Nobel Prize. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Oh, Roz had a book review this morning, Maggie's pointing to, so that's fun. Definitely like that. Shannon says, early translations of the Irish works were done through the Christian lens. Later translations, not so much. But unfortunately, since the originals were written by monks, it's still through the lens of Christianity. Yeah. So I was listening to, I think it was a TikTok actually, about pagan, and how pagan was actually a word coined in the early AD era for non-Christian beliefs. And so it was just like a catch-all term. But now, like, we ascribe certain meanings to it. So yeah, translation is interesting stuff. Raz says, I like the way the International Booker awards their prize to the author and the translator. It recognizes that it is judging both. Yeah. And do they have people who are reading the original language? I think one of them did. Let me go back to this article. So, let's see. This was A Year of Reading the World. This is a blog from Anne Morgan, who is a Royal Literary Fund fellow and editor and translator. So she's talking about, I think, a year or two ago, excuse me, the TA First Translation Prize went to Bela Sheyevich and Jacques Testard for the English edition of Svetlana Alexievich's Secondhand Time, which I have seen around on BookTube, and I think is well regarded. So for that prize, the prize goes entirely to the people who brought the text into English and not to the original author. Yes, let's see. It's great to see a literary prize that shifts the focus entirely onto the craft of recreating a narrative in another language. Too often, translators are overlooked when books from elsewhere are discussed. And she mentions that it's, sometimes even hard to find the name of the person who translated them. Let me pop this in the chat in case you want to read along. Okay, and then here's the thinking behind the award. Daniel Hahn is explaining how they came to this first year of this new award. Either you're really judging the translation as an act of translation, or you're basically judging the new text as a standalone thing, which just happens to have its origins in another language. This prize isn't quite either of those, so it's in between. There's a lot of, here we go. You're dependent either on judges being able and willing to read originals, or having a big team of multilingual assessors who can report on this aspect on the judge's behalf. So then, yeah, it just becomes a more complicated process. Goodness. I am tired, but I didn't realize my voice is going to like completely fail me today. Apologies, everybody. I'm going to have some tea because this is called baller status only tea. Hoping that helps. So some of the questions they're considering. Did it work as a piece of English? How did the voices sound? If there were English jokes, were they funny, etc.? We could get a sense of whether a translator is having to do something particularly demanding. Our winning book is a dazzling piece of polyvocal English writing, and Bella Sheyevich and her editor made the dazzling things happen in English. And they're talking about the counterexample of a picture book. But as with so many things connected to international literature and cultural exchange, there are no easy answers to the question of how we ought to weigh translations. But that's part of the fun. Maybe. Maybe. So how we ought to judge translations is a completely different question. So that's one of my questions from later, but I think I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So what about the use of the other in literature? How often? Let's start with that. Sorry, I'm backtracking because I got a little pulled away from the comments. How often do we read translated literature? I think Roz is our outlier here in the comments. But, there's something called WITS in August. So if anyone is looking for a readathon as an excuse to read translated literature, WITS is Women in Translation, which has a lot of good supporters here on BookTube and is pretty easy to find some titles. For the May of the Moderns readathon, if you look in the description, there are a whole list of books and some links to buy them. And there's one that I really wish I had gone for, but I did not. So I do not read translated literature that often these days because I'm reading backlist. I'm reading according to my diverse ebook, indie, audio, research, that sort of thing that I'm doing, trying to balance each month. And so putting another theme on it makes it extra hard. And so May of the Moderns, I really had to dig. So I've got a fair stack of literature and translation, but not between 1901 to 1945. So what I came up with was these two. Let's see. I tried Quit India and Other Stories by Ismat Chugtai because I had heard Amrita by the Book mention this in a video of hers over a year ago and found this at the bookstore and was like, snapped it up. It's short stories, but it's there are two that are in our period. So those are the two that I read. And just to give you an idea, it starts out, they're like linked short stories, and they're a couple of kids growing up in a heightened othering relationship because it discusses the difference between Hindu and Muslim populations and the sort of constant tension in India as these characters are growing up and what they do. And it really gets into othering in a completely outside English context. So there's that to appreciate, but there's a lot of context that I'm missing. And so my next question, besides how often do you read translated literature, is how much of the cultural context is lost on an ignorant reader versus how much cultural understanding is gained. So, I mean, this is an answer that I don't like, but in terms of this book, my reading it didn't bring me as much cultural understanding as reading nonfiction about the conflicts did that was in English that I could understand, that was, focusing on me as the audience, which, I mean, is sort of obvious, but also sort of disappointing. Because if you're trying to go to the direct source and appreciate the original art, you need to do more work. Surprise, you need to do more work. So like, I have a couple things turned down to read from. Here's a piece of one of the stories. This girl is out wandering and she goes into this room and she thinks that someone is talking to her, but it's actually someone who's not looking but thinks she's someone else. And so he's like upbraiding her because he thinks he's talking to a servant, and instead she's in there and she's getting madder and madder because he's assuming this tone with her until the person finally realizes that he's talking to the wrong person and is completely embarrassed. So one more thing. Did you wash my socks? The address had been written on the envelope by now. He's writing something out. Beardew and washing socks. Why don't you speak, you dog? The broad back moved to the other side, and the head covered with thick hair turned. Are you, The envelope fell to the floor and was picked up. One or two strange things now happened. Beardew, I don't know where he went, scratching his head. The door opened and a grimy boy looking panicky darted in out of breath. Beardew heaved a sigh of relief and straightened up. Oh, embarrassed and flustered, she left the room, but on the stairs she was taken aback by what she heard. And so he's talking to the kid again and taking out his frustration and his embarrassment on the servant kid. And so when I read this and I'm looking at dialogue and sort of stuttering dialogue that's trying to communicate embarrassment, which is a big cultural context type of thing, I feel like I'm losing a lot in the context, not knowing. And Ismat Chugtai, at least these two stories, because they're dealing with young people, I think is using a very stripped down language, a very simplified language, or at least the translator is. Tahira Naqvi, who's translated this from the Urdu. And so that is an example of a piece where I was sort of left feeling like I'm getting maybe 50% of this. But then here's a more positive example, and it's in the next one. And this is a completely different narrative voice, and this is easier for me to access. And we'll talk about accessibility in a second. But so there's been a riot, there's been a baby left, and someone's taking care of it, but they don't know what religion the baby is of. So there's like a whole stramash about who should be taking care of it. The nation began to awaken. Very soon, certain respectable personages found out that a Muslim, in quotes, child was being raised in a Hindu household. The Hindus were compelled to rise up in its defense because they were convinced that the child was a high caste Hindu. Both sides expressed apprehension and spread the idea that, quote, Islam is in danger, end quote. The most prominent servants of the nation, that is, editors, began screaming at the top of their lungs. Meetings were held in which it was established that, because the child's religion was being threatened, the country was in imminent danger of being destroyed. The very child who had been rejected by both Hindus and Muslims, because no one wanted to pick it up because they didn't know whose it belonged to. If he and others suffering the same fate had quietly breathed their last while fighting the dogs on the street for scraps, no one would have minded. But now the ruination of his religion, and with it the downfall of religion in all of Hindustan, was inevitable. Who could stand by and see this happen? Zoomies. The matter escalated. Both parties provided hundreds of witnesses to determine the religion of this child, but the rope continued to be tugged from both ends. Donations were collected by both sides, and an actual fund was established, the like of which might never have been set up for a city suffering the aftermath of an earthquake. There were so many innocent people far removed from religion, whose only religion, in fact, was poverty, who were close to starvation. But money was being poured into the pockets of lawyers and witnesses. This was how a nation worshipped religion. And so talk about accessible. So that, not dialogue, not as much context, still stripped down language, but with a narrative tone that is more judgy or more analytical, and also a little tongue-in-cheek, because it winds it up with, this was how a nation worshipped religion, which is like, I don't know, not thumbing its nose at it, but there's a phrase I'm trying to think of. That means trying to use an ironic tone, right? To explain that the situation was absurd and the othering that these two groups were doing was helping nobody except getting rich people richer. And I thought, yes, that is a truth that appeals to me. And I didn't have to do as much work. So I felt like that was more accessible. So that was my interesting experience with this. Let me catch up on the chat because I know I went in for a little bit of a long reading here. Jim says, many early English readers of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy thought they were similar because they were both translated by Constance Garnett. I remember hearing about that in another live. What are you doing? Okay, we've got a Zoomy situation here. Sorry, everybody. Roz says, I was so delighted the Book 2 Prize has a translated fiction division for the first time this year. Nice. Yes, and I liked listening to the people who did the translated books divisions. I think that was one of my favorite ones to listen to. Jim says, 3 of the 8 books on my June TBR are translated works. The Master and Margarita from the Russian, The Black Book from the Turkish, and All the Names, which is a Portuguese original. Cool deal. Roz says, Chuktai was impressively modern, I thought. Nice. And sometimes I find I have to dip in and out of Google and Wikipedia as I read to get some context. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Maggie says, having to look into cultural context when reading translated books is a must because even common seeming colloquialisms mean different things from one country to another. Yes. I was reading during a sprint yesterday, the day before, and Not Without Laughter, and they had a phrase about belly buttons being layovers for dawdlers or layovers for meddlers or something. And I was like, okay, I can tell this is a sexual euphemism for somebody, but I'm not exactly sure what they're getting at. So it was one of those things where, like, I'm not going to find that in a Wikipedia or Google entry. It's an idiom from an earlier time and a population that has changed its language, its slang since then. So it's pretty inaccessible, but I get the flavor of it, you know? So I am an outside observer, both in time and place and culture. And I'm trying to understand what I'm reading and the tone and the message based on like that flavor. So there's a lot of room for getting it wrong, but hopefully that's why Buddy reads. Like we can pool our resources and bounce ideas off of each other and see if we get it. So Roz is applauding Jim's translated works. Shannon's mentioned in the belly button thing. It's just like one little phrase mentioned, but yeah. So okay, so I just talked about this book that I started. So I didn't finish it because only 2 of the stories of the collection were from the 40s and the rest were from the 60s and later. So I'm going to be coming back to that at some point. But I did go to another book that fit. So I think these 2 efforts sort of add up to finishing the prompt if you know, if you're going to be lenient. So this is Yasunari Kawabata's Snow Country, which won the Nobel Prize in 1968. But hear me out. Let's see, where's the introduction part where it says when it was written. Snow Country was begun in 1934 and published piecemeal between 35 and 37. In 1947, a final installment was added and the novel completed as it stands today. So I figured it was mostly finished by 1937 so I could get by, even though it wasn't translated until 68, and that's when it won the prize, I imagine. Sorry, guys. I did a lot of talking last night. I had a tense discussion. So my voice is like giving out on me. And I have a couple examples in this book as well. Well, not really good for the translation aspect, but interesting points that I took away. So there's a lot of talk about wasted effort. For that very reason, it pulled at him with the attraction of the unreal. In the introduction to this book, there's a lot of talk about how he basically took the haiku form and translated it into an English novel with this. And that was pretty inaccessible to me. So that's like my drawback example, is that I haven't read a lot of translated Japanese literature, which is probably obvious. But in reading this, the things that pulled at me were imagery related, were relationship related, were not naturalism like we discussed with the octopus, but fatalism. And I feel like I'm biased because I feel like I have that impression of Japanese culture in general. So I might be like laying that on myself rather than the book telling me. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Whether you approach a book in translation with a preconception of what you will find. And so you're using your own like impressions of the other, or your limited understanding of that culture to bring understandings on it that might not be true. So I got to acknowledge that as well. And then this other part I underlined. Okay, so, well, Chijimi country. Oh, this is talking about the bleach fields. Okay, so that's not a language example. I've read haikus. It's not just formatting, obviously. It's not just number of syllables. But there's something insaisible. There's something like undefinable that I have not studied enough to recognize the correlation between that and this that some of the reviewers talked about. So need more effort. Just good to know. So those are my two for the prompt. Did y'all read translated literature for May of the Moderns? Let me know in the comments. Let me catch up here. Shannon says, I also thought I had sexual overtones. Yep, the belly button comment. Maggie says, getting the milk for free is the best example I know of. In America, it means promiscuity, but my friend from China says it means someone who steals the credit benefit for work they didn't do. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, it's an idiom like word for word, but means vastly different things. And he just warning me, don't be sure you can't Google it. I've Googled weird stuff and gotten answers. I mean, true. We can always go like find it in the depths of, research conversations. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Hamilton Thompson has arrived. Call me a navel gazer. Well, maybe not in this context. Maggie says, so true. Insert Hagrid. I should not have Googled that meme. I don't know that meme that you're talking about. Hagrid as in Harry Potter? And Ross says, I love it when a translator gives a sense of distinctive turns of phrase or ways to describe things. Yes. And they stick with you, right? So here's an interesting thing. So early, just like personal anecdotes, early influences for translation. When I was studying abroad and I had like a theater course, Nancy Huston is one of the people that I read, and I have kept this. And it's got all my marks in it of translation and whatnot. And it's like in the style of Samuel Beckett. So it's like meandering and stream of consciousness, but it's bilingual on both pages. And so you're allowed to meander and see how she not only plays with translation by showing you her process, but also by meditating on the art itself in the text. And it's pretty fascinating. It's called Lamb or Limbo. And I just, partly because it was a formational experience studying abroad, partly because I think just like the love of the French language is what made this so impressed into my psyche. There's a phrase, cloué sur place. And like, when you translate it and you say nailed to the spot, people don't really use that anymore. And I don't know if people use cloué sur place either, but it was performed as well. And so it's so vivid in one language, and in another, it's just lackluster. And so it's just like, it's an interesting meditation on early influences of translation and the meaning of another language or an idiom in another language. And then on one of my trips after that, when I went back, I would go and pick up things like this, which is English literature in translation, because I thought I could cheat a little. I could use something that is originally in English and practice that way, because it would be pretty simple, like murder mystery. And I think this is the only Agatha Christie I've ever actually read, which is in French. And I don't know which one it corresponds to. Un meurtre sera commis le, and then it just sort of dribbles off. So I remember having to look up words, but I did not take notes in this one. And I remember let's see, this is a while ago. It's probably like 15 years ago now. Being dissatisfied. I've also got some Sherlock Holmes in French translation. Um, being dissatisfied with my understanding of the idioms in the target language in French. But again, put in more work, right? So that's fun to think about, the reverse, even though it's far away from our discussion about the other. This is my little personal anecdote there. So yeah. Jim's asking, do Americans consider the Bible to be a book in translation? I mean, I do. That's the whole point of like the King James version, is that it was like the official English version at one point in time. And I still hear people mention new interpretations of the language that it was found in. So Hamilton's, unfortunately, no translation for me. Still working on Lady Chatterley's Lover. Excellent. And not like that. Get your head out of the gutter. Oh, we're trying to make a joke. Thank you. Appreciated. Maggie says, which translation of the Bible? There are 23. Oh, I bet there are more than 23. They're all translations. There's no original manuscript, just copies of copies, and in different languages, right? Because I know at least the Greek and the Aramaic are two. Maybe the Gospels are in different languages, depending on where they were found, because they were copies of copies. Who knows? And in terms of my own interest, who cares? So what else do we have for the opposite? We've got books that I've had for a long time that I have not tackled. So here's like the call to anyone who's interested. Marguerite Yourcenar, Mémoire d'Adrien. So this is someone put this on their list recently. It wasn't Rosie. I think it might have been someone else. Had this for a long time, have not attacked it, too intimidated. This has been on my list for a long time as well. Pirandello, 6 personnages en quête d'auteur. So 6 characters in search of an author. I think this is Italian translated to French, and I got this when I was studying abroad, so we're talking 20 plus years. Yeah, la traduction française. So yeah, translated into French from Italian. So I would have no clue about like the secondhand, third-hand judgment of quality in this. That could be an interesting read. Tell me if you want to read this with me. That'd be fun. And then the reverse again. So I've got Shakespeare. I've got some Shakespeare plays that are in French that, again, because I have some familiarity with it, and it's not going to be as easy as Agatha Christie to read, but familiarity will help. So, you take the cheats you can. This one I got, Irene Nemirovsky, Suite Française, which is very popular in English, but I thought, hey, I can find a French version, which is the original. And that would be really cool to read. It's contemporary World War II fiction, but I think it's more like creative nonfiction, in fact. So that would be really neat. There's the reverse, Conan Doyle, La Grande Ombre. So these are the kind of like pocket ones you can get for a few bucks at the Bouquiniste. And then there's back to like the intimidating classics like Malraux, La Condition Humaine. Like, yeah, that's not going to be heavy at all. No problem. And Sartre, see, this is like one of the ones that I would be like, am I going to get the jokes? Am I going to get the irony? Am I going to get the tone? And I have no faith that I would, because like the philosophy background is just not there. That's not something that I was ever trained in. So I got it in the hopes, and then I'm like just too intimidated by it. So how do you get around that intimidation? How do you, if you have the goal of reading translated literature to expand your horizons, to break down the barriers of that other in the world that is language and literature and translation, how do you get around that intimidation factor? Well, let me know your thoughts on that. Oh, and Hebrew. Thank you, Jim. Hamilton says, I see you've pulled your Victorian era summer garb from storage. Queen of maximum SPF. Nice. That's funny. Yeah, when I started out, I said we're giving Mary Poppins vibes or See's Candies. Either one, Jim says the Hebrew word chayo, translated as strength, force, or capacity when referring to men, but as virtue or chastity when referring to a female. Interesting. How would you know? Roz says Memoirs of Hadrian is brilliant, in translation at least. Yes, I know. But did you read it in school when you had like people to discuss it with? And I don't know. I feel like I've read a few, not many, but just like a few classics like that where I've been like, I'm reading it and I'm understanding one layer of the meaning and like I can just tell I'm missing out on a whole bunch. And I feel like a community is what is needed to get more at that more and be able to appreciate it more. So yeah. And outside of the modern era and outside of my French little shelf that I thought I'd talk about here, I've got other books in translation, like from Japanese, Ascendance of a Bookworm. This looks like manga, but it's a book. And I got this from my brother a couple years ago for Christmas, and I've been waiting for a fun time to read that. I've got translated from Russian, Dostoevsky, and I'm waiting for Victober to read this. Should be good. I've got the Czech. I found this at a used bookstore as well. Bohumil Hrabal, Closely Watched Trains. And this is from early 60s. So it's like just out of the time period. But I'm part Czech. So like this caught my eye. And, you know, Becky at the Teacup the Storyteller is in Slovakia, Slovak part of Czechoslovakia. Slovak Republic. Sorry. Czech Republic, Slovakia. There we go. And so she's like brought this on my radar as well. So I thought, and here's the thing to get back to the moderns part of it. People on the West can scarcely appreciate Hrabal's status in Czechoslovakia, where he is considered almost a national hero, a revolutionary of prose, an innovator, a revitalizer of language. In short, a man who has opened up new vistas for Czech writing. Oh, okay. And then he's talking about war, and he's got a different view of war than Americans typically do in their fiction. So I want this to apply, but I've set up rules that like are too narrow for my interests here. Machado de Asis's Epitaph of a Small Winter is a classic that's pretty popular at this point from the Portuguese. Someone read it with me, right? I need like just a full-on a buddy read sign up for the year. This was from Elizabeth at Bouquins Books, Gabriela from the French Canadian, one of them. So I have the Tin Flute up here, which I didn't get to in my overflow pile, but Garden in the Wind is another translation. Ooh, I think it's, is it Young Gifted and Black or is it Black Girl Writing? I think it's Young Gifted and Black. It's a great channel who does a lot of French African translations, and she does her channel videos in both languages. And she's a super fan of Sam Ben Usman, and so she has several like fangirl videos of his writing, and so she's got me very excited to read this. So I picked up God's Bits of Wood, and I know there's at least one other in my used bookstore that that will be available if I like this. But again, she is so excited about it. She has such great thoughts about the themes and the turns of language. So I would have to go back and watch her videos very carefully to get as much as I want out of this, you know? So again, discussion, illuminating works that are hard. A Season in Reata. This is translated from Maryse Condé, who is a huge French writer. I just read her Segu, but it took me 4 months in translation because it's just a monster tome of a book. And this has to recommend it that it's much shorter. But yeah, that, yes. Hélène from Books by Laxness is the German booktuber who reads French and is in love with Maryse Condé. So she's the one that got me excited about Maryse Condé. But I was slowed down. I was slowed down by Segu because it's such an epic and it covers so much time and so many characters. And it was hard for me to keep it all together after reading it for so long of a time. So I should revisit. And we've got more French translation, The Madmen of Benghazi. We've got A Palace in the Old Village. Tahar Ben Jaloun, another one from the French, and my wish list, which is like modern French rather than historical. So yeah, I've got the resources, but I'm sort of limited by my intimidation factor or, previous experience or just wanting to give it my all and not knowing how best to do that. So yeah. Okay, back to my outline. I had some good questions here. How do we consider translated literature differently? So as I was just explaining, when I read something like Segu and it's got little asterisks in not each page, but many pages to tell me in West Africa, this meant this in their religion, or in West Africa, this meant this type of person in the social status system. That was helpful as part of the translation. And there was still plenty of personality in the writing and the translation that I could appreciate. So I liked that. So I feel like when I look at translated literature with that as a particular example, I think translation was fine. I think the original is the one that sort of lost me on the scope and the broadness and the sprawlingness, if that makes sense. In a similar way that the octopus did, because it was like physical descriptions. Can we not? Can we not? And that was just an English one. So, but like you say, you have to, I may be judging things wrongly, but it's sourced in my enjoyment of the book with any experience that I have reading that era, that region, that style. And yeah. Oh, Shannon has to go. Getting ready for the interview. Take care. Thank you for coming by, Shannon. I'll see you on Tuesday. Shannon says, I wish I could remember enough French to read books written in French. 20 years ago, I could have done it. I know. So that's, yeah, we need a little renaissance of French reading for sure. Tahar Ben Jaloun is very popular in the Francophone world. Yeah, which is probably why I was able to find a translation of his work, right? Because as I said at the beginning, overwhelmingly English language world in the publishing world. So your pickings are slim. So only the breakout ones are going to be available. Melissa, hello from Fully Booked. For me, the type of French is important. French dialects are so different across the world. I miss nuance with French that is not Canadian. Yeah, there's that too. And this is going to be one of my wrap-up questions, which is when I think about the other and translated literature, when we're talking about English, but non-standard English, such as AAVE, which I've just seen discussed in some awesome booktubers channels like Bree at Locked Booktician. There is all sorts of judgments heaped on choosing to use non-standard English. And there's even judgments and like weightiness in using that term, because standard English is a thing, right? It's determined by the dominant culture and whatever. So when I read something that has AAVE in it, or when I read the beginning of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it's got this language that is very difficult to understand what's being said, that's a barrier to me, right? So I have to do some work trying to understand the content, first of all, and then to see if I can get at any of the flavor, whether there's overtones, whether there's idioms that I could possibly try to find on Google if Anita is right. And so to me, that's another way of actually translating or having someone that is an other in the dominant culture that is being filtered through to me. And here I am with a direct resource. I'm looking at a book written by a person who chose to use this language. So what can I draw from it? And like, how can I get the resources to understand what they mean and understand why they used it? And like, on purpose, what their intent was. So yeah, I think that's important to try to do as well. Melissa says, have just read my first Russian lit, a short story, and would now like to check out more. Nice. Very nice. I don't know if anyone else found it hard to find translated lit in 1901 to 1945. Like I said, there's all these examples in the description box that I looked up via a Book Riot list. But in terms of me finding used copies of these, I had a bunch that didn't apply. So I did my 2 that sort of added up to 1, and that's what we got this year. But here's the one that I recommend you all read for next year, which is where'd it go? There we go. Soseki Natsume, I Am a Cat. And let me just read the description of this, and this can be my sign off if no one else has any more comments. That is the title. And don't tell me to. There we go. I Am a Cat. It's really cute. Written from 1904 through 1906, Soseki Natsume's comic masterpiece, I Am a Cat, satirizes the foolishness of upper-middle-class Japanese society during the Meiji era. With acerbic wit and sardonic perspective, it follows the whimsical adventures of a world-weary stray kitten who comments on the follies and foibles of the people around him. A classic of Japanese literature, I Am a Cat is one of Soseki's best-known novels. So even just having a blurb like that says it's satirizing upper class society in the Meiji era gives you a context where you can go through and be like, okay, this is comic. This is how I'm supposed to understand this. Whereas if I'm jumping into a book like this, A Palace in the Old Village, and I'm like, what is the political leaning of the author? What is happening in this country in the time frame? What is the social system set up? Like all these indicators that would give us more information about who has power, what the dialogue means, what the tone changes mean. Those are all things that I really value in literature. And so if I am trying to understand the other as a life project, I got to do the extra work. So that's why I should probably join a book club. There's booktube book clubs that are about translated literature. There's a Wits-related readathon, and someone just mentioned Caribathon. Yep. Roz says, June is Caribathon and a great chance to read books that use Caribbean English or patois, which is perfect. And Melissa is also very excited about Caribathon. Had a great experience last time I participated. So it looks like I have a plan for June now. So that's pretty cool. So I did just read Tell My Horse, which is Zora Neale Hurston's nonfiction set in the West Indies, which, would have applied, but that is no longer an option. So, I've got this one, which is historical fiction, The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, written by a Latinx author, who I am most anxious to read, but I don't know. There's a lot to choose from. So I guess I'll be checking that out for June. But yeah, I would recommend people check this one out if they can find a copy of it. Bookshop has them. So okay, we're rounding out the hour. I will let you all go. I didn't think I would run this long, but I've been trying to pull from all these different things. So apologies for not being quite so focused. This is such an interesting topic with so many different spokes to the wheel that I think I just touched on many of them instead of focusing on one and going in depth, which is kind of my jam for the mini lecture for these Sundays for May of the Moderns. So I hope at least whetted your interest and you want to know more, or some of the books you're interested in reading, or you want to buddy read some of them, please contact me ASAP. That'd be cool. And yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you, Jim, for reminding me of the Invisible Cities Project. June is for reading books from Congo and Qatar. Okay, nice. The Invisible Cities Project, I think, is every 2 or 3 months. They have 2 or 3 countries where they focus on that region, and then they discuss the books that people read for that. So I remember it started a little over a year ago, maybe. and I was interested and then sort of like dropped off. Because one of my big overlaying goals is to read books I own. So with that in mind, I'm going off to the used bookstore to unhaul a bunch of books, good ones, and pass on the used book love and see what I find there. So yeah. So this is the last little mini lecture for May of the Moderns. I thank everybody for tuning in, for dealing with the ridiculous and, silly outfits and attempts at levity for the May of the Moderns looks. I appreciate all the people who were the celebrities to give me my prompts. So thank you, Roz and Brian and Bree. I have the playlist for all the videos that I've done, as well as everyone else's reviews, so that we have it all in one place. So that's easy for people. And let's see. The remaining things are the buddy read that I have with Beth Ann and Shannon on Tuesday. It should be at 5 p.m. Pacific, tentatively. And then Wednesday is going to be our wrap party. So I've tried to reach out to the folks I know who have read books for May of the Moderns on Instagram to try to just like get the link out a safe way, and let me know if you're interested, if you've read books and you want to come on and talk about them, or just let people know that your channel participated in the readathon. I'm up for including you. I do want to do outreach and exposure and promotion and all that stuff for May of the Moderns lovers. So we'll be happy to have you on Wednesday. That will be about 5 p.m. Pacific as well. So late for the UK people, unfortunately, but that's the middle of the week, June 1st, that we're dealing with. And then I am popping off down to California for a couple months. So I will be busy and in transit and seeing what to do. But apparently Caribathon is in my plans for June. Alrighty, so yes, the other literature translations. I wanted to give shout outs to my friends who are translators on BookTube. So if you look down in the description, I have Elizabeth of Bouquins and Books. Bouquins and Books, depends on if you're switching to English in between or at the end of the word. She is in Canada and translates from English and French. And Kazan from Always Doing is in Japan and I think does like medical translation between Japanese and English. And JD, who is all about the translation between Spanish and English because he has a poetry collection he just translated. He started off with a bilingual collection, some in Spanish, some in English, and then has ambitiously endeavored to make a version that is all English and all Spanish. So he's had to translate his own works into the opposite language. And he says, especially for Puerto Rican Spanish, it's very difficult to find the exact meaning because of the context that is missing, even for other Spanish speakers, because Boricua Spanish is so particular. So looking forward to that, to grabbing a copy of 2020, which is the all English version of his bilingual poetry collection. So that should be fun. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in and sticking with me for this month-long readathon of May and the Moderns. Don't forget to taste life twice, read a book. Happy weekend, and I will hopefully see you on Tuesday or Wednesday. And that's it for today. Thanks, everybody. Bye.